What if I told you that the British Empire wasn't really built by soldiers or warships? What if the real secret weapon wasn't cannons or cavalry, but something far more powerful hiding in plain sight? Something that's still controlling your life right now, at this very moment, and you don't even realize it. Before we dig into this buried truth, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. Trust me, what you're about to discover will change how you see money, power, and the entire world economy forever. Here's what they don't teach you in school. When you think of the British Empire, you probably picture red-coated soldiers marching across continents, massive ships with cannons pointed at distant shores, and the Union Jack flying over colonies from India to Africa to the Americas. That's the story they want you to believe, the story of brave explorers and military genius. But that's not the real story. The real story is about something much quieter, much more sinister, and infinitely more powerful. The British Empire was built on debt. I know that sounds boring compared to tales of epic battles and naval warfare, but stay with me because this is where it gets absolutely wild. What Britain figured out before anyone else was how to turn money itself into a weapon. Not gold coins, not treasure chests, but something invisible, something that could multiply endlessly and never run out. They weaponized credit. Let me take you back to the 1600s. England at this time was honestly kind of a mess. Spain and Portugal had massive empires stretching across the globe. France was becoming a superpower. The Dutch controlled world trade and had the most advanced economy on the planet. And England? England was basically broke. Their kings kept borrowing money and then refusing to pay it back. Imagine if you kept defaulting on your credit cards over and over again. Eventually, nobody will lend you money anymore, right? That's exactly what happened to England. By the late 1600s, their credit rating was garbage. Nobody trusted them. And without money, you can't build armies, you can't build navies, you definitely can't build an empire. But then something happened in 1694 that changed everything. Parliament created something called the Bank of England. Now, on paper, this sounds incredibly boring. Rich people would lend money to the government, and the government would pay them back with interest. Yawn, right? Wrong. This was revolutionary. This was the moment everything changed. Because what England had just invented was a way to make debt permanent, reliable, and tradable. Instead of kings making shaky promises they'd never keep, now you had an actual institution that guaranteed repayment. Investors could buy government bonds knowing they'd get their money back, plus interest. Suddenly, England could borrow massive amounts of money at low interest rates. And here's the kicker. They could keep borrowing again and again as long as investors believed they'd be repaid. This was the cheat code. This was the hidden weapon that nobody else had figured out yet. Think about it like this. War is expensive, insanely expensive. Throughout history, kingdoms would fight until their treasuries ran dry, then they'd have to stop and go home. But now, Britain had found a way to keep the money flowing even when the actual gold was gone. They just borrowed more. Let me give you a real example. In the early 1700s, there was this massive conflict called the War of Spanish Succession. Britain, this relatively small island nation, somehow managed to fight for over a decade against much larger, richer countries like France and Spain. How did they afford it? They borrowed constantly. The Bank of England backed the loans, investors kept buying bonds, and the war machine kept rolling. France, even though it was wealthier on paper, kept defaulting on its debts. Their interest rates skyrocketed because nobody trusted them. Britain's rates stayed low because everyone knew they'd pay back. War had become a financial competition, and Britain had rigged the game in their favor. This pattern repeated over and over. By the 1750s, during the 7 Years' War, Britain borrowed over £100 million. That's an
absolutely staggering amount for that time period. They used that money to fight on 4 different continents simultaneously: North America, the Caribbean, Africa, India. And who collapsed under the financial pressure? France. The war bankrupted the French government so badly that it directly led to the French Revolution decades later. Meanwhile, Britain walked away with a global empire and a class of wealthy investors back home who were getting richer from all those interest payments. You see what was happening here? War wasn't just about patriotism anymore. It was a business opportunity. But let's dig deeper.
Because war was only half of this scheme. The other half was trade. And this is where things get really dark. You've probably heard of the East India Company. Maybe you think of it as just some old trading company that sold spices and tea. But that's like calling a tiger a big cat. Technically true, but missing the terrifying reality. The East India Company was a monster. It was part corporation, part government, and part military. Rich people in London bought shares in the company, expecting to profit from trade. But those profits didn't come from fair business deals. They came from conquest. The company had its own private army. Let that sink in. A corporation with an army. They didn't just trade with India, they conquered it, piece by piece. They bribed rulers, fought wars, and eventually started collecting taxes from millions of people. All that money flowed back to London, into the pockets of bankers and investors. Here's how the cycle worked, and pay close attention because this is the key to everything. Britain borrowed money to fund wars. Those wars led to victories. Victories expanded trade routes and territories. That trade generated massive profits and tax revenue. Those revenues paid back the debt. And because the debt got repaid, investors were happy to lend even more money for the next war. It was a perpetual motion machine of empire. Debt feeding war, war feeding trade, trade feeding debt. And while everyone focused on the generals and admirals, the real power sat in London counting houses, where bankers orchestrated the whole system. Fast forward to the early 1800s and the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon dominated Europe militarily. He was a tactical genius, nearly unstoppable on the battlefield. But he had one fatal weakness. He couldn't compete financially. Napoleon funded his wars mostly through plunder. He'd conquer a territory and seize their wealth. Britain, meanwhile, just kept borrowing. Over the course of those wars, Britain borrowed more than £600 million. 600! At one point, just paying the interest on their debt consumed almost half of all government spending. But investors never lost faith. Why? Because Britain's empire now spanned the globe. Trade was booming. Industry was exploding. Everyone knew that empire would generate enough wealth to cover the loans. Napoleon might have won battles, but Britain won the financial war. And in the end, that's what mattered. Now here's where we need to talk about the human cost of all this, because it's not some abstract economic game. Real people suffered. British taxpayers were crushed under the weight of these debts. The government taxed everything: tea, sugar, tobacco, salt. Ordinary people paid higher prices for basic goods so that wealthy bondholders could collect their interest payments. The poor funded the profits of the rich. And in the colonies, it was even worse. Take India as an example. The British extracted enormous wealth from India through taxes and trade. But when famine struck, grain was still exported to meet global market demands, because that's what generated profit. Millions of people starved while food left their shores. The financial system demanded efficiency and profit. Human lives were just numbers on a ledger. This is the brutal truth about how finance and empire worked together. It wasn't just about military conquest. It was about creating a system where money flowed upward to investors while everyone else paid the price. Let's jump to the mid-1800s and talk about the Opium Wars, because this might be the clearest example of how Britain used finance as a weapon. Britain had developed an addiction to Chinese goods. Tea, silk, porcelain, everyone wanted them. But China only accepted payment in silver.
So silver kept flowing out of Britain, which was a huge problem. British merchants, backed by powerful financiers, came up with a solution: sell opium to China. They grew opium in India, smuggled it into China, and used the profits to buy Chinese goods. Problem solved, right? Except the Chinese government realized opium was destroying their society and tried to stop the trade. Britain's response? Send warships, start a war, force China to keep buying opium and open more ports to British trade. This wasn't about freedom or civilization. This was about balancing a trade deficit. Britain went to war to protect drug dealers because the financial system demanded it. And once again, the profits flowed back to London, enriching the same banking class that financed the whole operation. By this point in history, Britain wasn't just an empire, it was the world's banker. The City of London became the financial center of the entire planet. British banks financed railways in South America, mines in Africa, plantations in the Caribbean. If you wanted to build something big anywhere in the world,
You probably needed British money, and that money came with strings attached. Britain established something called the gold standard, which meant their currency could be exchanged for actual gold at a fixed rate. This created massive confidence in British money. Investors worldwide bought British assets because they knew they could always convert them to gold. This system gave Britain incredible power. Countries that wanted access to British capital had to align their economic policies with what London wanted. Britain was basically exporting its monetary system across the globe. You either played by their rules or you didn't get the money. For wealthy investors, this was paradise. Steady returns, global reach, minimal risk. For colonized nations, it was a trap. Their resources were extracted. Their economies were restructured to serve British interests. Debts were imposed that could never be fully repaid. The whole system was designed to funnel wealth from the periphery to the center. And here's what's truly mind-blowing. This system didn't end with the British Empire. The financial structure that Britain built in the 1600s and 1700s is still the foundation of how the world works today. When governments borrow trillions of dollars, when wars are funded through debt instead of taxes, when investors profit from conflicts that devastate ordinary people, this is the exact same playbook. Britain might not rule the waves anymore, but the model they created still rules the world. Think about World War I, financed by debt on an unprecedented scale. Britain borrowed heavily from American banks to sustain the war effort. World War II shifted the balance even further, with the United States becoming the new financial center, but using the identical British formula: debt, bonds, and the merger of money with power. Even right now in the 21st century, when you hear about quantitative easing, sovereign debt crises, or international bailouts, you're seeing this same system at work. Central banks, government bonds, credit markets, all descendants of what Britain pioneered centuries ago. The uncomfortable truth is this: real power isn't about having resources or even military might. Real power is about controlling the financial system. The people who issue the debt, who set the terms, who control the flow of capital, they're the ones who actually run the world. Britain's bankers understood this 300 years ago, and the system they built lasted longer than any empire won through battlefield victories alone. So here's the question I want you to think about. Who holds that power today? When you see global debt measured in the hundreds of trillions, when wars seem to go on forever despite public opposition, when financial bubbles inflate and burst, leaving ordinary people broke but major institutions intact, do you think we've escaped this system, or are we still trapped inside it? Everything points to the same conclusion. We're still living in the world that British bankers created. The names have changed, the locations have shifted, but the fundamental structure remains the same. Debt is still weaponized, credit is still the hidden source of power, and most people still have no idea how the game actually works. That's why understanding financial history isn't just interesting, it's essential.
It's the only way to protect yourself from being exploited by the same dynamics that built empires and crushed civilizations. You need to understand how money and power intertwine. You need to question the debts you're told are inevitable. You need to recognize when economic crises are being used as opportunities for others to profit at your expense. Because history doesn't just repeat itself mechanically, it evolves. The players change, the technology advances, but the underlying patterns remain consistent. And if you don't understand those patterns, you'll be crushed by them just like countless others throughout history. The British Empire discovered that controlling money was more powerful than controlling territory. They figured out that debt could be transformed into dominance. They learned that financial systems, once established, could outlast any military conquest. And that knowledge, that system, that power, it's all still here, still operating, still shaping your life in ways you probably don't even recognize. The question is, now that you know, what are you going to do about it? If this changed how you see the world, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Here at Monetary Archaeologist, we dig up the buried truths about money, power, and history that they don't want you to understand. Because the past holds the key to decoding the present. And trust me, we've only scratched the surface. There are deeper layers to uncover, more connections to expose, and more secrets to bring into the light. This is just the beginning. The empire of debt never ended. It just changed hands.
And understanding that might be the most important thing you learn this year.